Just 2 weeks to go now till the midterm elections, but a lot of Americans, especially Republicans and those who follow Donald Trump, tell pollsters they do not have much faith in the integrity of our elections or in mail-in voting. The person responsible for elections in each state is the Secretary of State. In Vermont, Jim Kondos is retiring after 12 years. The office is wide open. This morning, the two who want the job are here to share their views. Brooke Page.
Hello there.
Welcome to NBC5 In Depth.
My pleasure.
Happy to have you. So you're running for Secretary of State this year. You've run a lot over the years. This year, though, that is your priority. And, you know, for most of us, that means you're the state's chief elections official. Do you have confidence in the integrity of our elections?
I personally don't think there's a legal standard, and that's are the errors, corrections, and fraud in the election sufficient to change the outcome? And I do not believe that they are. Okay, the problem is many people think that there's mischief afoot, and that's confirmed over the years by our open primary process. And
but in the general election, can we trust our elections?
I would like to think so, okay? And the problem is many people don't. And I think that one of the jobs of the Secretary of State is to provide the assurance, not just going, oh, everything's fine, don't worry about it, but to being able to address all the questions being brought up, and instead of being blown off, you know, drive them to ground.
You're not an election denier, though. The 2020 election was fairly decided. The count was accurate?
I know that President Biden is in the White House. Okay, if you go up to the front door and knock, that's the person you'll be looking for.
Right. That's not the question, though.
I understand. I would like to think that the count on election night was, for the most part, accurate. I think the problems with the election are further upstream, that now we're finding out that, like, the FBI had their finger on the scale a little bit. Obviously, the media has been biased towards one side of the election, at least in the presidential primary. And cumulative, these things cause a problem. You know, was the election fair? Maybe not. Was the count on election night fair? Probably.
Let me ask you, if you're successful and become Vermont's next Secretary of State, does it really matter to the average Vermonter who is our Secretary of State, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat?
Well, it shouldn't matter whether, I mean, understand that the four offices that I was in the primary, none of those should be really highly partisan political positions. They're all ministerial jobs. Secretary of State, Attorney General, Auditor of Accounts, State Treasurer. You know, these shouldn't be highly politicized issues. And so the question is the person that's running and what's their philosophy as far as elections.
You are on the warpath to change Vermont's primary election and make it a closed primary so that Democrats and others can't cross over and create mischief for the other party.
Realize this starts a long way back before I ever show up on the political scene. One of my favorites is, what, 98, when John O'Brien got Fred Tuttle, his character in Man with a Plan, to run against Jack McMullen. And in the end, Fred Tuttle had no intention of running. John O'Brien was a good friend of Pat Leahy and was doing him a favor.
It was an embarrassment to the Republican Party, for sure.
It was. And more recently, as you and I discussed off camera, Peter Welch getting up and bragging how he must have done so well, even the Republicans made them his candidate.
So you want that to change?
Yeah.
You want a closed primary? Beyond elections, the Secretary of State has a couple of other key functions.
Absolutely.
Office of Professional Regulation, archives, library.
Right.
How are those? Would you make a significant change there that we should know about?
I think that in OPR, Office of Professional Regulation, that the incumbent office holder has turned it into this Leviathan sea creature with tentacles out into all manner of commerce in the state, and that we have to certainly register the businesses, license the businesses, but as far as the overseeing of these businesses, I think many of the professions, there's about 52 that are regulated, about 30 of those are in the healthcare or health professions, everything from nurse practitioners to tattoo artists to beauticians. And I think these would be better overseen by the Department of Health rather than the Secretary of State. And so I'd like to see a consultant brought in to do a top-down analysis of what's going on in OPR. As far as archives is concerned, the archives are in poor shape. And the Secretary of State's taking over the state library in Mount Pelier hasn't done anything to help. All of those volumes that were open to the public are now hidden behind closed doors, either at Middlesex or in Barre at the Vermont Historical Society. Worse than that, many of the volumes, historical volumes, are in tatters and have not been restored. And this is a tragedy as far as the history of our state.
Couple of quick ones. Jim Condos is stepping down after 12 years as Secretary of State. What word describes your view of the job he's done?
Or
Vermont now mails general election ballots to every registered voter. Should that process continue?
Isn't that a tragedy? We know that 440,000 ballots went out the other day. We also know that maybe as many as 8,000 of those were mailed to dead people.
Okay.
This is
a travesty then. Do you favor making Election Day a state holiday?
I do. And let me point out the difference between me and my competitor this time out. My competitor said, when I mentioned that it should be a state holiday, said, "Oh, how wonderful it is." And then I had this look and say, "Yeah, but you want to have early and absentee voting, or universal vote by mail, 45 days in advance. What value would it be to have Election Day as a state holiday when you've had elections going on for a month?"
Do you support non-citizen voting in local elections?
I think that citizenship is a privilege, okay? I think that if you want to become a citizen, then do so. And then you will avail yourselves of all of the benefits of citizenship. And voting in local elections, just like voting in state and federal elections, is a privilege earned by citizenship.
Brooke Page, Republican candidate for Secretary of State, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Stuart.
The Democratic nominee will share her views with us when we return. Sarah Copeland-Hanzus is well known at the Vermont State House. She's chair of the House Government Operations Committee. But this is her first run for statewide office. She won a three-way Democratic primary in August for Secretary of State. Sarah Copeland-Hanzus, welcome to NBC5.
It's nice to be here.
Well, it's nice to have you. Congrats on your primary election win. We're 3 weeks out. The Secretary of State, obviously known principally to most Vermonters as the chief elections official. So
Yes.
right out of the gate, do you have confidence in our elections? Are they counted fairly? Should all Vermonters feel good about things?
I think Vermonters should feel very confident about our elections. We have 240-something locally elected elections administrators for a population the size of the city of Boston. And I feel really good about each of those individuals' integrity and commitment to democracy.
Does it really matter, do you think, to the average Vermonter who is Secretary of State? Does it matter if you elect a Republican or a Democrat?
Well, In years past, this would be sort of a sleepy little office, and there might not be a lot of engagement around the Office of Secretary of State. I think when you put this in the national context of the moment we're in, all of a sudden Vermonters are like, oh my gosh, this is really important.
Because there are some who are on the ballot for Secretary of State in other states that deny the 2020 election.
Exactly. You know, there's this whole movement of fix 2020 first, or, you know, stop the steal. Allegations about stolen elections that have been across the board unfounded.
You are not an election denier.
I am not.
What do you say to those who are?
I would say you need to refresh your understanding of how elections work, and listen to the elections officials who are working on behalf of the citizens of your city, your state, your county, depending on where you live. Many Vermonters know their town clerk in person and talk to him or her in the grocery store or after church on Sunday, and we have a great deal of faith in the people who are administering our elections.
But if you're elected, what will you do? I mean, isn't it a problem that we have some proportion of Vermont voters who are not sure they can trust elections?
Yes, that is a problem. And while the proportion of those people might be relatively small, I think it's really important that the Secretary of State's office over the next 2 years embarks on helping restore people's understanding of and trust in not just elections, but in democracy as a whole. That's why I want to bring back the Education and Outreach Coordinator. This is somebody who can help to develop civics curriculum for our school teachers, but also can go with me out into Vermont communities and really engage with people about how democracy works. Because when you understand how government works, you're not as susceptible to those lies about stolen elections.
The other components of the Secretary of State's office, of course, you oversee the Office of Professional Regulation,
yes.
Which, you know, unless you're a licensed in a licensed trade or occupation, you may not know.
Yep.
And the State Archives and Library.
Yes.
How are they running now? Would they be a target of reform for you?
So, you know, when I go out on the campaign trail, I oftentimes will stop in at licensed professionals, whether it's a dentist office or a tattoo shop or a hair salon, and say, how is your license renewal process? How's it working for you? And by and large, what I get is a lot of really good reports about, yeah, it was not a problem. I got a reminder email. I logged on. I logged my, professional education credits, and it was really simple and easy. The Office of Professional Regulation is a well-run office, and I want to make sure that we continue with that really good customer service. In terms of archives, we are now fully into the digital age in terms of where our state records are coming from. And so we need to invest in the infrastructure, in the digital infrastructure, and in the manpower to help Vermont state agencies understand how to preserve records.
Jim Kondos is stepping down this year after 12 years as Secretary of State. In a word, how would you describe the job he's done?
Only one word. Pro-voter, hyphenated.
Pro-voter.
Yes, that's one word.
All right, that's fine. Would you favor making Election Day a state holiday?
So I've had this conversation a lot during the campaign because, people are all concerned about trying to do whatever we can to increase the turnout so that people can participate in their democracy. The reality is, though, a holiday it's not going to help your grocery store worker. It's not going to help the person who is the attendant at the gas station. These businesses are open 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So it's not the only tool that we could consider, but it's certainly worth having that conversation. Now that we have universal vote by mail for the general election, it gives us 6 weeks for people to spend time with their ballot, look up the people who are candidates on their ballot, and decide who they want to vote for. It may not be as critical that we make sure people have that last day off, as long as they have ways that they can access information about the candidates and get their ballot back to their town clerk.
As a legislator, you supported this automatic vote by mail, where
Yes.
all general election ballots are now mailed home. There is some concern that a lot of extra ballots are being mailed to people who do not live here any longer. Does that concern you?
So, yes, it does, because I don't think we want to be careless. But the reality is that the maintenance and upkeep of our voter checklist is a continuous evolution. You know, I have friends who are moving from one house to another, you know, this week. And so, yes, they no longer live at the address where their ballot may have gone. And so we just need to give the support that our towns and cities need in order to keep their checklists up to date.
Quickly, before we run out of time, do you support non-citizen voting, allowing non-citizens the right to vote in a municipal, local election? So
that charter change request from the city of Montpelier and also from the city of Winooski came to my committee when I was chair of government operations. And yes, I supported it. We spent a lot of time, talked to a lot of constitutional scholars, a lot of historians, kicking the tires and making sure that non-citizen voting was legit and allowed and within the purview of those municipalities. So yes, I support them in being able to do that.
Sarah Copeland-Hanzus, Democratic nominee for Secretary of State, good luck, and thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.